In this video, we're explaining Invincible Season 2 in around 10 minutes or less, and by the end you'll have everything you need to know going into Season 3. Okay, so Season 2 begins in an alternate timeline where Invincible actually helps Omni-Man to take over the planet. This version of Earth is one that's been torn apart by the Viltrumites, but underground there's a resistance group which includes Robot, Eve, and a guy called Angstrom Levy. As the resistance is then about to be massacred by Invincible, Angstrom suddenly gets sucked through a portal and brought into the main dimension that we know from Season 1. For context, in this series there are infinite dimensions, and in nearly all of them, Angstrom Levy doesn't have any powers. However, in the main timeline, he has the power to create portals between dimensions, which allows him to rescue these other versions of himself. As a scientist, his goal was to combine technology from all the different dimensions so that he could transform this timeline and every other timeline into a paradise. That's why he needed all of his alternate selves, because he wanted to transfer their knowledge into his single brain. To do a transfer like this, he obviously needed help from the Mauler twins, who for some reason always get broken out of prison, and before the transfer begins, they tell him not to remove the helmet. Unfortunately, during the process, Invincible shows up, having been ordered by Cecil to shut down the machine. Following this, Mark gets beaten up as usual by Maulers from all these different dimensions, who try to kill him even though Angstrom clearly didn't want that. To save Invincible's life, the scientist then takes off his helmet, which is, as we know, the one thing he shouldn't do, causing a massive explosion that vaporizes everyone. The only 3 people who survived were Invincible, one Mauler twin, and the main Angstrom Levy. Because the transfer wasn't complete, his brain was now a scrambled mess, and he couldn't tell which memories belonged to him and which memories belonged to the other versions of himself. This confusion is why he now wanted to kill Invincible, because in most of the other timelines, Mark is an evil Viltrumite who murdered Angstrom's family. Now, switching over to the Guardians of the Globe, because Robot was now in human form, he began to feel afraid on missions for the first time. This meant he just wasn't as effective on missions, and Cecil chose the Immortal to replace him as team leader. On top of that, the heroes Bulletproof and Shapesmith were added to the team, although Shapesmith was actually just a Martian in disguise. Back in Season 1, he used his powers of transformation to steal the identity of an astronaut called Rus Livingston. Once he arrived on Earth, he was then inspired to become a hero, although from the start, Cecil knew that Shapesmith was a Martian. Speaking of Cecil, after everything that happened with Omni-Man, Mark agreed to do anything he says, almost as a way to prove that he's not like his dad. As a result, Invincible was sent on a bunch of different jobs, and during a mission to Atlantis, he encountered this creature. The sound it could make was seemingly dangerous for a Viltrumite, and Cecil immediately got his people to look into it. Meanwhile, billions of miles away, Alan had a meeting with the Coalition of Planets. In this scene, Alan tells them how Omni-Man abandoned the Earth, and how Mark is possibly the first good Viltrumite. News like this was interesting to Thetis, who's the leader of the coalition, but in private, he warns Alan that there's a traitor somewhere in their organization. Sure enough, later that same day, Alan gets attacked by 3 Viltrumites who heard about his meeting with the coalition. In the process, they literally tear him apart, but to Alan's credit, he still doesn't reveal anything about Mark or Nolan. Despite that, these 3 Viltrumites pretty much search the universe, and eventually they find Omni-Man on the planet Thraxa. Before we get into that though, there's a couple things we have to know. Firstly, it had now been 6 months since Nolan left the Earth, and during that time, Mark graduated high school and arrived at college with Amber. As soon as he got there, he was then approached by this alien bug, who claimed that 42 billion people on his planet were in danger. Invincible agreed to help even though Cecil told him not to go, and 6 days later, he arrived on the planet Thraxa. There, he was unexpectedly greeted by his dad, who was now emperor of the whole planet. It turns out that when Omni-Man left Earth, he nearly ended his own life by going into a black hole. At the same time he was about to do that, a damaged Thraxian ship was also getting sucked in, and then Nolan went out of his way to save them. After this incident, the Thraxians made him their leader, and he even began a relationship with one of the bugs that he saved. That said, probably the craziest part about all of this is that his new wife, Andressa, gave birth to a half Thraxian, half Viltrumite baby. According to Viltrumite rules, a child like this has to be terminated, as they're only allowed to have children with genetically similar species, like humans. For that reason, Nolan was concerned that when the Viltrumites find this place, they're gonna kill him, and from Mark's point of view, everything about this whole situation just made him angry. To him, it seemed like his dad moved on way too fast for just 6 months, but despite all of his feelings, he agreed to help his brother if the Empire attacked. The plan was that Omni-Man would start training him to fight, but the 3 Viltrumites arrived before they could even begin. In the battle that followed, Nolan killed 2 of the invaders while injuring the 3rd, and by the end, both Invincible and Omni-Man lost consciousness. When Invincible finally woke up, his dad was taken away to be executed by other Viltrumites who showed up later. One of those people was General Krieg, who basically told Mark to prepare the Earth for a Viltrumite takeover. To be specific, Invincible's job was to make sure the Earth doesn't resist the Viltrumites, otherwise Krieg promised to kill millions of people when they arrive. Over the next 2 months, Mark then stays on Thraxa to help rebuild the planet, and when he eventually leaves, he takes his brother with him. This was something Andressa personally asked him to do, because Thraxans aged so quickly that she was already an old woman and was about to die pretty soon. Understandably, when Debbie found out, she couldn't believe that Nolan already moved on like this, but she agreed to take care of the baby because it's Mark's brother, while rejecting Cecil's offer to give the child to him. Now, after just arriving from space, Mark was sent back out there again, as there was a Martian ship heading directly for Earth. On this ship were mind-controlling parasites known as the Sequids, and the only reason this was even a problem is because of Shapesmith. In Season 1, when he left Rus Livingston on Mars, the real Rus got infected by these parasites. The Sequids now plan to do the same thing to everyone on Earth, and honestly they would have succeeded if it wasn't for a very impressive performance from Rudy and Atom Eve. It's important to note that Rudy had been actively learning to control his fear through meditation, allowing him to create this anti-Sequid device in 5 minutes. After saving Rus Livingston, the Guardians then head back home, only to find Rex on the verge of death. For context, while some of the heroes were in space, Rex, Duplicate, and Shrinking Ray stayed on Earth to deal with any threats that might pop up. One of those threats was the Lizard League, who are usually no big deal, but on this one occasion, they managed to get their hands on nuclear weapons. During this mission, Shrinking Ray broke nearly every bone in her body, Duplicate was killed, while Rex had a hand bitten off and literally got his brains blown out. Despite all that, he did still save the day by defeating King Lizard, and was then patched up by the GDA. As a side note, someone else who the GDA patched up was Donald, who you might remember was killed by Omni-Man in Season 1. Luckily for him, his brain was still intact after this incident, and Cecil put Donald's consciousness into a cyborg. It turns out that in reality, this had happened over 30 times before, and after each death, Donald asked for his memories to be erased. This time, however, he decides to live with the trauma and uses the experience to help someone else in a similar situation. Now, back at college, Amber and Mark's relationship was going terribly, given that he was always away on missions. That's why when Alan shows up to bring him to the coalition of planets, Invincible refuses to go back to space. Since the last time they met, we know that Alan was almost beaten to death, but after his recovery, Thetis believed that he was now as strong as a Viltrumite. To make things even better, Thetis revealed that he is secretly a Viltrumite himself, meaning the coalition has 2 people that can fight against the Empire. For that reason, they wanted to add Nolan and Invincible to their ranks, but for now Mark just wasn't willing to leave. That said, Alan didn't leave empty-handed, because years ago Nolan wrote these sci-fi books that revealed the weaknesses of a Viltrumite. As he was being taken away on Thraxa, he told Mark to read them, and in this scene Alan scans the whole thing. Following this, Invincible makes a deal with Cecil where he gets 2 nights off a week to take Amber on dates, but things quickly get interrupted when Anissa shows up and threatens to rip off Amber's head. Anissa is a Viltrumite working for General Krieg, and her mission here was to convince Mark that Earth would be better off under Viltrumite control. She claimed that with Viltrumite technology they could end world hunger and put a stop to climate change, and all she wanted was for Mark to say that he'd take over the planet. Over at the GDA, Cecil even tells him to say the words, but Invincible just can't bring himself to do it. As a consequence, Anissa gives him yet another beatdown, and she warns Mark that if he doesn't change his mind, someone stronger will come to teach him a lesson. After leaving Earth, the Viltrumite then runs into Alan, who also recently just left the planet. Although he could have won this fight, Alan lets himself get arrested, because thanks to Mark, he knew that Omni-Man was also in Viltrumite prison. His goal was to recruit Nolan to the coalition of planets, and in jail the 2 of them do make contact. Meanwhile, after nearly getting decapitated, Amber and Mark break up for her own safety, but before they really have time to process this, he gets a call from Angstrom Levy. Following his accident in the first episode, Angstrom travelled to a dimension where Invincible had been defeated by the GDA. There he found out that for a human to beat Mark, you have to just tire him out, and so Angstrom's plan was to wear him down by sending the main Mark to dozens of other dimensions. By holding the Grayson family as hostages, he was able to lure Invincible back home, and from there he sent Mark to a bunch of different timelines where he was attacked by cavemen, zombies, dinosaurs, a Dr. Octopus ripoff, and a lot more. However, the mistake Angstrom made was that in the main dimension, he attacked Debbie, and so when Invincible was briefly brought back to this dimension and saw that, Mark decides to channel his inner Omni-Man. In a blind rage, he pummels Angstrom Levy to death, which is the first time he'd ever taken things this far. Importantly, during this fight, they travelled across several different dimensions, and with Angstrom being dead, Mark had no way of escaping. Luckily though, for this version of Invincible, he was saved by the Guardians of the Globe. To be specific, these Guardians are from the main dimension, but 20 years in the future. In that sense, you could say that these are the original Guardians of the Globe, and in their reality, Mark never made it back home. Without Invincible, their planet pretty much went to but after 20 years, the GDA had access to both a time machine and an interdimensional portal machine. At first, the Guardians tried to save their original Mark who'd been stranded here for 2 decades, but Robot implied that that version went insane. Therefore, they went back in time to save Mark before he goes crazy, which is why they appear so soon after he killed Angstrom. The Guardians then open a portal for him to go back home, with the hope that he'll fix all of the things that went wrong in their timeline. Before he goes through, the older version of Eve confesses that she's in love with him, and she makes it clear that when they were teenagers, she wanted Mark to tell her how he felt, regardless of whether he's in love with her or not. She just wanted to know what he's thinking. With that, Invincible returns to the main dimension, but when he gets there, he isn't ready to tell Eve what he feels, partly because his breakup with Amber literally just happened. Now, a few things I didn't get to mention are that 1, the Immortal left the Guardians after Duplicate's death, since the two of them were in a serious relationship, and her being dead messed up his head. 2, when the Immortal left, Rudy replaced him as the team leader, so essentially he got fired and then rehired in the same season. 3, when the real Rus Livingston finally made it back to Earth, there was one last sequid hiding inside his stomach, which unfortunately took over his mind again. 4, Duplicate's powers allowed her to make copies of herself, but it turns out that the original Kate has been alive this entire time, and the real Kate goes to find the Immortal while he's living in the mountains. With that said, my friends, that was Invincible Season 2 in around 10 minutes or less, and if you liked it, please drop a like, please leave a comment, as all of that stuff does help me out with the algorithm. If you have any recommendations for what I should recap next, then please let me know in the comments below, preferably under 25 episodes, that'd be pretty nice. And until the next one, peace out.